We're back with another edition of TMO Live, the Media Online's video series where we ask newsmakers the tough questions and explore the hot topics. I'm the site's multimedia journalist, Michael Bratt. In this week's edition, we speak to veteran radio personality John Robbie. He made headlines at the end of last year when 702 announced his retirement after 30 years at the station and 15 years as the host of the station's breakfast show. Thanks for being here.
Nice to be here. Thank you for having me.
Let's talk about your departure from 702. In a statement, it said retirement. But I read a Business Day article that said you're not retiring. Was it your decision to leave 702 or was it 702's?
It was my decision. In the same way as I had a rugby career, I had a radio career, and I felt if I wanted to have another career before pipe and slippers, I had to do it now. And then there were a couple of incidents. So a year and a half ago, I went to Terry Falkvane, the head of Prime Media Broadcasting, and I said, look, I'm thinking of this. And then about 2 months ago, I felt it really had come the time. I went to them and said, look, I think it's time. And it's been fabulously amicable. These things rarely are in radio. And they've been extremely generous.
You are known for your no-nonsense, hard-hitting interviewing style. Where did you learn that?
I never had a lesson anywhere. I never had a media lesson before getting onto radio. And I think an inquiring mind. I happen to be Irish, and I think probably pub talk and robust discussion is very much a part of the Irish tradition. And I think that's where it came from. But basically, I mean, I was at 702 when it was a music station, doing sport and then sports talk. And we suddenly switched almost overnight to a talk station. So a bit like the station, I sort of made it up as I went along. And by goodness, I've made every mistake in the book.
What would you say to those people who haven't liked the way you've approached interviews with this style of interviewing?
Well, I mean, you can't please everybody. One of the things you learn about radio is that everybody is a program manager. Everybody thinks the station and everything about it is designed for them, therefore they know best. So, I mean, all you can do is your best. And I mean, I've made, as I say, many mistakes. I have offended people, never intentionally, I don't think. And all I can do is apologize to those people if they didn't like it. But it's funny, a very wise man said to me that every time you get criticism, and the more robust or horrible it is, rather than be worried about it, you should actually cheer, because it means that not alone are people who like you listening to you, people who don't like you are listening as well, and that's the real sign of success. So I always took them as a badge of honor. What
are you going to miss most about the time at 702?
Well, not getting up at 2:15 every morning. I'm certainly not going to miss that. But I think the friendships. I mean, the friendships amongst my colleagues. I don't think I have an enemy in the whole organisation. Maybe I'm wrong, but I don't think so. And leaving was incredibly emotional for everybody. There were lots of tears, I can tell you. But I think interfacing with the people of our listeners, that has been amazing. For every famous person that I've come across through radio, I mean, just the incredible stories and the incredible listeners that we've had. And I think being able to make a difference, that's what I'm going to miss. But hopefully in my new existence, I'll be able to do something similar.
If you look at the list of people you've spoken to over the years, it's a veritable who's who of personalities. Your best interview?
My favorite interview is Desmond Tutu, Archbishop Desmond Tutu. And if you're listening, Arch, I love you. He's just one of the most amazing men on and off the radio, so to speak. And we actually became quite close. And indeed, recently, I'm not going to give you the details, somebody was under a bit of pressure. And I thought, who is the one person who could help this person? And it was the Arch, who hasn't been well. And I managed to get in touch, and he came through and gave this person a lot of succor, if I can put it that way. So I think he is the favourite. I think interviewing Joe Slovo, the first legal interview he'd done in 30 years. I mean, we're talking back in I think 1990 now, just after the great opening of the country. I mean, that was unbelievable. I think that talking to a certain Minister of Health, which was a very controversial. I mean, I look upon that now with horror, because in many ways it was one of the most unprofessional interviews that I've ever done. And yet at the time, the message needed to be passed across to government about HIV and the treatment, etc. And I was one of the first people to lose my temper, if you like. So there've been so many of them that I also remember And here I'm not going to mention a certain producer who's now very high in the organization, doing an interview with a Senegalese expert on public monuments, of all things. Because in the new South Africa, there was a talk, what do you do about monuments like the Voortrekker monument in the new democratic South Africa? And he thought this would be a lovely interview. And so when I interviewed him live on the radio, we discovered he didn't speak a word of English. He only spoke French. So getting through that was one of the more embarrassing ones. But as you say, they've not alone been hundreds, they've been thousands.
And aside from the one with the Senegalese person, one that hasn't quite gone the way you'd hoped it would go.
The most horrible person I've ever met in my life was Jeffrey Archer, the author. And we'd set up an interview in London with him. We were over for a World Cup semi-final. And so we decided to do the show from London. And we had two big interviews set up. One was Bill McLaren, the famous rugby commentator, who was the nicest man. He's dead, sadly, now. And he came to our hotel room, did the interview, could not have been more generous. And as he left, he confided that he'd heard this that morning that his eldest daughter had been diagnosed with cancer. And what that man did to come across and do an interview, I'd known him years ago from rugby, because of friendship, was incredible. And then later on that day, we had to visit Jeffrey Archer. And I'm not going to say Sir Jeffrey Archer, because that would be, I think, honouring him in a way that I don't want to. And my wife was a big fan, and my father-in-law, who was recently bereaved, my mother-in-law died, and he wasn't feeling well, and they'd indicated that they were big fans of Jeffrey Archer. So I spoke to Jeffrey Archer's people and said, look, would you mind if they came just to meet him? You know, they're not going to be any, and he's fine, wonderful, marvellous. We went to his palatial offices overlooking Parliament, and we went up, and there was all, you know, magnificent Chagalls on the wall and so on. And he kept us waiting a little bit, and we could hear from the mezzanine floor this conversation talking about Maggie, and this slightly too loud so we could hear it. I remember thinking it. Then the great man came down, and he was so rude and wanted to know who these people were without, just so obnoxious. I mean, I thought he was joking first, and I was gobsmacked, and I'm very rarely gobsmacked. And then he said, right, let's do this. And I said, there will be no interview. With someone like you, packed and walked out. And so instead of interviewing, I told him the story. And about, I suppose, a few months later, I phoned my wife after the radio show, and she was in such good mood. I thought we'd won the lotto. And I said, why are you so excited? She says, you're never going to believe it. Jeffrey Archer's going to prison. And so that is, without a doubt, the most horrible, rude, obnoxious person I've ever met in my life. And if I never meet him again, it's too soon.
And you never interviewed him?
I never interviewed him, and hopefully never will.
Aside from that moment, any other unforgettable moments in your career?
So many. I mean, I think obviously meeting Nelson Mandela. I never interviewed him, sadly, but met him a number of times, had a meal with him, and was once told to shut up by him. So I think Bill Clinton and I are the only people who Nelson Mandela has told to shut up. But the moment he did it, he broke into a smile, and we joked, and that man was simply incredible. So, I mean, I think it's at the time, so many people met Nelson Mandela or saw Nelson Mandela because he worked so incredibly hard. But I think now that he's sadly gone, and you talk to particularly young people, when you say you've met Nelson Mandela or been told to, they look at you without, they can't believe it. And I think it's only now, after the passing of time, you realize what an incredible person he was. So that was very exciting.
I hope you enjoyed part 1 of our interview with John Robbie. Check back to the site when we're going to be uploading part 2. Until then, it's goodbye from me.